Professor Moretti will be speaking on tragedy and political conflict. We will be recording today's lecture, and at the same time, it is being live telecasted on YouTube. There will be a question and answer session at the end of Professor Moretti's talk, and all of you are requested to kindly post your questions in the chat box. These will be addressed to Professor Moretti by Ms. Sakshi Dogra. This lecture series is being organized under the guidance of our head of the department, Professor Simi Malhotra. Simi ma'am is professor and head of the department at the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, Delhi. Her research interests include contemporary literary and cultural theory, culture studies, and heterodox Indian philosophies, theology, and aesthetic practices, particularly Sikhism. Her latest publications are the edited books Food Culture Studies in India, Consumption, Representation, and Mediation, and Inhabiting Cyberspace in India, Theory, Perspectives, and Challenges, both from Springer in the year 2021. She is the recipient of several grants and awards, the latest being the 2020 Duo India Professor Fellowship Award. I request Simi ma'am to kindly introduce the lecture series and welcome Professor Moretti.
Professor Franco Moretti, our speaker this evening, and all others who have joined us from across the world and across time zones, I, on behalf of the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, and our collaborating partner, Department of English and American Studies, University of Würzburg, Germany, extend a very, very warm welcome to all of you to this Ministry of Education MHRD Spark supported Distinguished Lecture Series. Friends, this series is part of the ongoing collaborative project between the Department of English, Jamia, and the Department of English and American Studies at Würzburg, which is titled On New Terrains of Consciousness, Globalization, Sensory Environments, and Local Cultures of Knowledge, which is supported by the Ministry of Education's initiative SPARK, Scheme for Promotion of Academic and Research Collaboration, which aims to facilitate academic and research collaboration between higher education institutes in India and abroad. Friends, we are extremely fortunate to have with us Professor Franco Moretti, one of the most important intellectuals of our times, as our speaker this evening. And indeed, it is indeed an honor and privilege for us to host Professor Moretti, albeit virtually, and we are all eagerly waiting to hear him speak. I'm extremely grateful to Professor Moretti, and I thank him profusely for indulging us and for so readily agreeing to be part of our series, and in fact, inaugurating this series, which we call the Distinguished Lecture Series. I once again extend a very, very warm welcome to Professor Moretti and to all of you. And now it is my honor and my privilege to introduce Professor Moretti formally, though, as we all know, he needs no introduction anywhere in the world. Professor Franco Moretti is the Daniele C. and Laura Louise Bell Professor in the Humanities, Emeritus, at the Department of English, School of Humanities and Sciences, Stanford University. With over 100 academic publications on diverse areas of significance to his credit, Professor Moretti is the author of Science Taken for Wonders, 1983, The Way of the World, 1987, Modern Epic, 1995, Atlas of the European Novel, 1800 to 1900, which was published in 1998, Graphs, Maps, Trees, 2005, The Bourgeois, 2013, Distant Reading, 2013, and Far Country, Scenes from American Culture, which was published in 2019. At the forefront of combining literature and technology, Professor Moretti used computer-generated visualizations to depict the evolution of new genres in Graphs, Maps, and Trees. The Bourgeois, of course, is an intensely insightful book of literary criticism in which Professor Moretti examines the bourgeois class via the medium of literature. One of Professor Moretti's most popular works, and who does not know this anywhere in the world, Distant Reading, won the National Book Critics Circle Award for focusing attention on what he called the great unread. Using the method of quantitative literary analysis, he published several distinct essays in Distant Reading that became precursors to advances made in digital literary studies. He was the chief editor of the 2 volumes of the novel, which was published in 2006, looking at the plurality of the genre and its criticism in over 100 commissioned essays dwelling on the complexity and reach of the form. At Stanford University, Professor Moretti established the Center for the Study of the Novel and the Literary Lab, His work at the Literary Lab has been crucial in establishing the field of literary criticism in digital humanities. Professor Moretti has delivered lectures as part of the Gauss seminars at Princeton, the Beckman lectures at Berkeley, the Carpenter lectures at the University of Chicago, and has been a visiting professor in many countries, which I possibly cannot name here. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, of the American Philosophical Society, Academia Europa, and of the Scientific Board of the Institute of World Literature at Harvard University. In 2015, Professor Moretti was elected as a permanent fellow at the Berlin Institute for Advanced Study. He writes for New Left Review, and his works have been translated into several languages. His research areas include, and obviously they're not exhaustive, British literature, comparative literature, literary criticism, cultural theory, the novel, and digital humanities. We can't tell you, Professor Moretti, how grateful we are for you to inaugurate this distinguished lecture series for us. And it's really our honor and our privilege to have the possibility of hosting you here. And we're really, really thankful to you for indulging us so much and taking out so much time from your schedule for us. Thank you so much, Professor Moretti. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm the one who's grateful. It's an honor, it's a pleasure, it's a delight to be in touch with people who are far away in times like these. And the title of my talk today that you see there on the screen, it's a strange title. It's not my idea. It comes from Hölderlin. And his notes to Antigone, Hölderlin translated Antigone, and he wrote two short essays, one on Antigone and one on Oedipus, that are, as all the things he wrote, very compressed, very cryptic. At a certain point, he says, the Greek tragic word is deadly effective. He loved to compress terms like this. It's deadly effective in the sense that it leads to a genuine murder by words, which is my title. What he meant by that is that words in tragedy are often the instrument of death. And this can take, at times it's a very direct form. When Creon in Antigone, the sovereign of Thebes, orders Antigone to be buried alive, his edict, his pronouncement actually is her death. I mean, it follows inevitably. Other times it's more indirect. In Othello, Iago cannot force Othello to kill Desdemona, but he manages to persuade him, to beguile him into believing in betrayal that's never happened. So there are many strategies, from direct coercion to indirect persuasion, but they all converge towards the same outcome, which is that in tragedy, usually harrowing death is accompanied and often prompted by extraordinary, unforgettable language. It's a very strange union of death and great language. Now, why does this happen? Because words in tragedy are part of a conflict to death, and therefore they get radicalized very quickly into these extreme outcomes. Not all tragedies end in death. Not all theorists identify tragedy with conflict. So I'm only really talking here of a subset, even though I would say the most interesting subset of the genre of tragedy, Western tragedy. The theorist who first posited this connection was Hegel, and especially in the sections on tragedy in the Aesthetics, which I am trying to call up. Dramatic action rests entirely on collisions of circumstances, passions, and characters. What we see in front of us are specific aims individualized in living characters and conflicting situations. So this is going to be the thread of my talk, these conflicting situations. But what kind of conflict? Now, talking about conflict and death, it is inevitable to think immediately of war. by a coincidence, sort of neat coincidence, the first tragedy that has reached us from ancient Greece in full, Aeschylus' Persians from the beginning of the 5th century, is entirely devoted to one of the most famous battles of European history, the Battle of Salamis. But at the moment the tragedy begins, the battle has actually already ended. There will be a messenger who arrives and tells the story, but tragedy lies not in the battle, it lies in what follows the battle. Agamemnon, also by Aeschylus, begins at night. There is a watchman on the roof of the palace. He's forced to stay awake night after night, like a dog. He's there afraid to even sleep for a second because there is a sign that he's there, that he has to recognize and immediately notify. It's a sign of a fire coming up at night. And sure enough, the fire comes up. It's in Crete on the top of Mount Ida. And then it comes nearer, Lemnos, Mount Athos, nearer and nearer to Argos. Fire in the night, he immediately says. What signal is this? It's the sign that Troy has fallen. And of course, it's burning also. So the Greeks are coming home. The war, the classical war for ancient Greece has ended, and the tragedy is about to begin. Antigone, the first song, the first choral ode, beam of the sun, fairer than all that have shown before here in Gedes, in Thebes of the Seven Gates. Finally, you have appeared, eye of golden day. The night is over. The siege of Thebes has been rejected. The enemy army has been defeated. The city is saved. The day has come. Tragedy has already begun. Hamlet begins also at night. There are soldiers on top of the palace. They're nervous. They talk of recent wars. They wonder about current preparations that seem to hint at another war. A ghost appears, and he's in battle. He's in armor, in battle dress, so to speak. But in the next scene, the king sends an embassy to Norway. There will be no war. There's an army that crosses the stage, but it goes elsewhere. So I've given a few examples, many others could be brought. So it's a very strange situations in which war is always near tragedy, but never actually in tragedy. It's there and it's not there, so to speak. It's there, I think, in order to destroy the regularity of every day, in order to unleash the fury that will make tragedy possible, the violence that is necessary for these plots. Think of Macbeth. Macbeth has a double opening, the witches and then the battle that reveals Macbeth's fury in killing the enemies. It's a double opening, but it's really the same opening. The war is what has liberated the witches. It's what was dark, what was unthinkable has come out in the open. So war as the trigger for tragic action, but not as its core. And the reason here is quite simple, because war is usually waged against an external enemy. Persians, the Turks, the Protestants, the enemies of Brandenburg, whatever. Tragedy is, as a rule, not directed at external enemies, but at internal ones. Not war, but civil war. The war within the family, as the French classicist Nicole Leroux called it in one of her wonderful essays. The Seven Against Thebes, the two brothers, Eteocles and Polynices, who kill each other in front of their city. Lear's daughter, Neron and Britannicus, also brothers in Racine, Karl and Franz Moor in Schiller. So this fratricidal element, and then of course the Oedipal element, not brother against brother, but children against parents or vice versa. There is Oedipus, there is Orestes, there is Electra, Hamlet, Sigismundo, Don Carlos, etc. So civil war as the horizon of tragic conflict. Horizon only because in the theater, you know, it's a stage, it's a handful of characters, so political conflict has to be stylized by what is simply a very small number of characters. The war within the family, as Loro puts it, not within the states. Still, so there is definitely this stylization, but there are a couple of very strong structural parallels that exist. And the first, I owe them to an Italian historian of civil wars, Gabriele Ranzato, as a specialist of the Spanish Civil War, but then he has extended to other civil wars, especially in the modern world. The first has to do with neutrality. Of course, in every civil war, there are a lot of people who remain neutral. In fact, this gray zone is larger usually than the areas that actively fight each other. The point is, neither of the factions in conflict recognize the legitimacy of neutrality. Civil war is a situation in which whoever is neutral is usually forced to take sides. The same in tragedy, except for very peripheral characters. Whenever a tragic plot gets going, all the characters who are near the main characters, the forces in conflict, end up having to take sides or being caught in the conflict anyway. Hamlet, there are several characters close to Hamlet and the king. Only one of them takes sides, Laertes, but all of the others die even before Laertes. This is one of the astonishing things about, you know, Polonius is killed, Ophelia dies as a consequence, Rosencrantz is killed, Guildenstern is killed, Gertrude is killed, Laertes is killed. Hamlet and the king are the last two to die. In the meantime, whoever lay in the middle in this area, so impossibility of neutrality, this is the first thing. And then the second thing is tragic violence, but actually it's always a disproportionate violence. And again, this is typical of civil war. Ranzato again points it out. He says, look, no matter how important the stakes were, there is an excess, there is a fury in civil war that is hard to explain, that cannot be explained simply with the necessities of the conflict. It's something deeper, darker, that goes back to instincts that are very hard to define. And the same in tragedy. It's not just death, it's blinding, mutilations, incest, rape, dismemberment, torture. It's really cannibalism, the Bacchae, Oedipus, Seneca, Lear, the Jacobean, Lens Soldaten, Penthesilea, Lulu. It's really atrocity. Okay, with this premise in mind, we move to the next question, which is this. Sorry, something ridiculous, but I have to take off for 10 seconds and let the cat back in. I mean, this is life. This is real life.
Please do so.
Done. This doesn't happen when one is giving a lecture in a room, but when one is at home. Okay. So I'm saying tragedy, tragic conflict, tragic form. I'm going to speak a little more than half an hour. How does one speak about a genre that has 25 centuries of history in half an hour? And one solution was given by Shklovsky in the Theory of Prose, not for tragedy, but for the novel, but the principle is the same. And there he writes at a certain point, Tristram Shandy is the most typical novel of world literature. So in other words, you understand Tristram Shandy, you understand the novel as a genre. So how do you speak of a great genre in a short time? By looking for the example, the text that summarizes them all. I'm a great admirer of Shklovsky. I think he was actually the most brilliant theorist of literature in the 20th century. But on this, God forgive me, but I think he was wrong. And I will actually do the exact opposite of what he suggested, not try to find the tragedy that summarizes them all, but actually looking for two extreme opposite examples. Extreme cases are revealing when we try to discuss a form, because they reveal the forces that act on a tragic form. If I manage, I would like to write a book on tragedy, which is all about extreme cases, as if to think, okay, genre, the center is hollow. What matters are the cases that are the opposite of each other. So anyway, this is what I'll do today with just two extreme cases. And the first one is Antigone. So Antigone, for those of you who are less familiar with the play, there has been the attack of the Seven against Thebes. It has been rejected. Eteocles and Polyneikes, the two brothers, have killed each other. And Creon, who is now the sovereign of Thebes, proclaims that Eteocles, who has defended the city, will be buried with all honors. Polyneikes, who led the enemy army against the city, will be left unburied, prey to dogs and birds and beasts of prey in general. Antigone is the sister of Polyneikes and of Eteocles, and she disobeys and she covers the corpse. A guard discovers her and he drags her in front of Creon. Do you admit you have done this, or do you deny it? I say I did it, and I do not deny it. And did you know of the edict that prohibited it? I knew. How could I not? It was clear. This is the initial exchange between the two antagonists. And much has been written about the values that are at stake here. Again, Hegel established a little bit the pattern for this. Creon stands for the law of the state. Antigone stands for the law of the family. One has public interest in mind, and the other has compassion for one's closest, dearest persons. So a lot has been said on these values. I will also say something later on, but mostly what I want to focus on is not what they say, but how they say it. That is to say, the form of dialogue. And now for us, of course, when we go to the theater and look at a play, dialogue seems to be the natural way for a play to go on, but actually it wasn't. This is not how tragedy begins. I have here a chart. There are two groups in tragedies, in ancient tragedies, that don't really engage in dialogue: messengers and the chorus. And as you can see, these are all the tragedies by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, all the Greek tragedies we have. At the beginning, the space of a tragic plot that was not occupied by dialogue, but by reports or by songs, was actually over half. And then as tragedy develops, it drops down, and simultaneously dialogue increases and occupies 80 or 90% of the play. So what this tells us is, okay, dialogue is not is not the birth of tragedy, to use that famous title, but it is very quickly where tragedy goes. I mean, it's an interesting chart in this respect. This one, it tells you a genre that begins in a certain linguistic mode, in a certain register, but very quickly moves in a different direction. Why? Because dialogue is where conflict and language meet. In dialogue, conflict is no longer something that is spoken about. It is the very way people speak. Conflict is no longer content, it becomes form. This is why tragedy is so attracted towards dialogue. Everything is speech against speech. This is Hölderlin again in his notes to Oedipus. And then Hegel, who once again, put it in the aesthetics. The completely dramatic form is the dialogue. For in it alone can the individual agents express to the face-to-face the ethically justified pathos which they assert one against the other in solid and cultivated objective language. So a conflict to death expressed face-to-face, gegeneinander, it's the adverb Hegel always uses in situations like this, one against the other, literally. And a conflict to death expressed in objectively cultivated language by antagonists who are both given meaningful objective values to express. This is incredible almost. So the Greek capacity to have enemies speak, the enemies of Greece itself speak, and speak powerfully, and to listen to them speaking while a conflict is going on. I mentioned Persians is the first tragedy we have. Well, in Persians, there isn't a single Greek, only the enemies of Greece, those who had tried to destroy Greece and actually had almost succeeded to destroy Greece only a generation earlier. So the capacity ancient Greece had to allow enemies to speak is truly extraordinary. And it's something that we have completely lost. What made it possible then? What is making it so hard today for us? This, I think, it's perhaps one of the great cruxes, one of the great problems of what we could call the political anthropology of tragedy. Unfortunately, I see the problem, I can see it clearly. I really have no idea of what the solution can be. So for once, I'm just posing a question to which I will give no answer. Then the rest of the talk, I'll try to do a little better. But it is a really important point. Think if today, who is capable of representing the enemy of his or her own culture in terms that make this enemy credible, valid, intelligent? It's really one of the hardest things. Bon, back to Antigone. Creon is a sovereign, is a man, adult, he's in power, he's surrounded by guards, he makes laws immediately or edicts, etc. Against him, Antigone, young woman, alone. She's of the royal lineage, it's true, but still the disproportion is extraordinary. The form of dialogue creates a counterpoint to this, balances their forces. Dialogue is form as a counterpoint to power, so to speak. Especially in one specific form of dialogue, which is called sticomythia. Sticomythia, that is to say, one verse each. This is what we had seen earlier. And this is the textbook example. Some tragedies is being calculated. Oedipus, for instance, is almost 50% in sticomythia. It's literally always one against the other, one against the other, one against the other. Did you know of the edict that prohibited? I knew. How could I not? It was clear. How could I not? Well, it is also this absolute clarity that allows Antigone to be a limit case. Human beings fear clarity and hate it, wrote Lukács in The Metaphysics of Tragedy. Even in tragedy, as we will see in a minute, clarity is not always a given. In Antigone, it certainly is. Words kill also for this reason, that they burn all the bridges. They are as sharp as axes. They are axes, in fact. They foreground the act. I say that I did it. I do not deny it. The first time the guard comes on scene, they found a corpse buried. The guard arrives, and the first words he says, I did not do the deed. Then he brings Antigone in later in the play. Here is the one who did the deed. So to act, is a crucial semantic field in the play. And since the clash is between family and state, family and polis, family and king, it feels natural to think that what Antigone does is what anyone would do in her position. That her ethical choice of burying her brother is a kind of immediate ethics, as Hegel calls it in the Aesthetics. But here, I think Hegel is wrong. The opening scene of the play is Antigone and her sister, Ismene. The first line of the play is such that it insists on the fact that their sisters, Hölderlin, who, as I said, loved to compress words, created a monstrous German word, gemeinsam schwesterliches. For this first line, it's the opening word of his translation. It means shared substance of our being sisters together, as if to say, we're one. Fine. But Ismene doesn't want to do what Antigone does. She doesn't want to bury Polynesius. She tries to convince Antigone not to do it. What Antigone does is not an immediate ethical act, what anyone would do. It's a choice. And to make sure that we understand that it's a choice, Sophocles has Antigone bury Polynices twice. She buries him once, the guard discovers it, the body is pulled out and left, and she buries him again. And this is repetition. Is a way to make sure that you understand that this is a decision. It's not an accident. Tragedy wants decisions, not accidents. And repetition is frequent in tragedy, much more frequent than in the novel. Sigismundo in Life is a Dream dreams twice that he is free. Herod in Herod and Mariamne condemns Mariamne to death twice. So repetition is crucial because it eliminates chance. Tragedy, as I said, wants decision. And in Herod and Mariamne, there is a moment, stop Herod, says Mariamne. Stop Herod. You have Herod. You have perhaps this very instant your fate in your hands and can direct it wheresoever you please. The moment comes for every human being when our star's charioteer hands over to us the reign of fate. This only is awful, that we don't know that moment. Antigone knows the moment. She not only buries Polynesius, she does it twice, she proclaims it. I say I did it. And she had already announced it to Ismene before doing it. Saying the deed aloud means making it public, giving it legitimacy. It means owning it. Hades and those below know to whom the deed belongs, says Antigone at a certain point. It's a fantastic formulation, to whom the deed belongs. The unity of actor and action. Tragic life, said Lukács in that essay in Life and Forms, Metaphysics of Tragedy. Tragic life is a kind of life that can be summarized in a single act. Antigone is the perfect example of this. All right, now moving to the opposite extreme case, which is Macbeth. Macbeth at a banquet, he's king now, all the nobles of Scotland are sitting around him, he's about to sit down, the ghost of Banquo appears. Macbeth addresses him. Thou canst not say I did it. I say I did it, thou canst not say I did it. See the opposites here. Earlier, a few scenes earlier, Macbeth had just killed Duncan, the king, And it's night, he's walking back, he meets his wife, and she realizes that he has taken the dagger that is full of blood with him. And she says, go back and put back the dagger in Duncan's bedroom and smear with blood the guards that are sleeping drunk next to him. And Macbeth turns around and, I'll go no more. I'm afraid to think what I have done. Look on it again, I dare not. So again, instead of bringing the deed openly into the open, in the sphere of language, what Macbeth has done is, as one of the witches will mumble at a certain point, this is a deed without a name. Antigone was proud of giving a name to what she had done. Macbeth cannot do that, cannot look at it. And so something unsayable, but like many things that are unsayable, it's always pressing to come out in the open. This is just before the assassination. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. See, the future murder, which is going to happen in a few minutes, it's everywhere here, but it's always hidden in that microscopic word, it, the neuter pronoun, as if to distance it from anything that is human. Nothing has happened yet, but the verb to do is present, and is present in the past participle 3 times. Done. It's a sort of, it's almost a death knell, you know, a bell sound. Done, done, done. The borders between subjunctive, indicative, conditional, subjunctive again, these are the modes that demarcate the real from the imaginary. And here they're so jumbled together, it becomes really hard to distinguish the real from the possible, what has happened from what has not yet. Oh, and all of this in 3 seconds. It takes 3 seconds to read these verses. These 13 monosyllables, one after the other. It's in an incredibly accelerated moment of compression. The only word with 2 syllables is the only slowdown, so to speak, is that quickly, which of course is the opposite of a slowdown. And then comes the real acceleration. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. If the assassination, after all these monosyllables, a 5-syllable word, it's like a bomb, really, this assassination. It's like, you know, moral enormity turned into sound. Bon, theories of tragedy often have a difficulty in explaining why we like tragedies. These are horrible stories, violent, very, almost always unfair, unjust. Why do we like them so much? This is a big problem, but at least here there is an answer given by some people. One of the answers is, well, we don't like the what, we like the how. We like the way in which these stories are presented. We like the poetry, this incredible linguistic creativity. What can we do with language? What could Shakespeare do, at any rate? Tragedy, this was my starting point. This is really, you know, the point of what I'm saying here. The miracle, but also perhaps the monstrosity, depends how you look at it, of tragedy, is to join the worst thing that can happen to a human being to some of the greatest poetry ever written. This is the paradox of the form. This is what tragedy does. So this extraordinary poetry of which it is capable, but there is also a problem. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well, it were done quickly. when you listen to it the first time, it's not that easy to understand. A few scenes earlier, Lady Macbeth is musing about her husband's personality. Thou'dst have great glamis, that which cries, thus thou must do if thou have it, and that which rather thou dost fear to do than wishes to be undone. Now, think of this in the theater, when words last a second and then disappear. This is very hard to understand. Hegel's theory of tragic conflict relied on the perfect clarity of tragic language. Shakespeare's poetry is a perfect example of how opaque tragic language can be. So why? Antigone's clarity was easy to understand. This opacity, a little less. Let me take a step back to address this question, because I've just said, the great poetry, the heights of tragic language in Shakespeare, but they don't happen a little bit everywhere. They're usually heavily concentrated in the language of the protagonists. And this signals a shift in the way the language of the play is organized. And I will show two histograms here. This is what could be called the word space, how many words the characters in Antigone speak. And as you can see, Creon speaks more than the chorus, that speaks a little more than Antigone, but still there is a certain balance between them. Here, on the other hand, is Macbeth. And here you see all balance has been completely destroyed. Here there is a sort of superhuman hero, there is no longer that counterpoint created by dialogue in Sophocles. There is a superhuman hero who is made even more charismatic by this incredible poetry that he utters. So there is a sort of a dark fascination with power that envelops this stage, which is dark in more ways than one. Here's Macbeth again. He's trying to understand why he plans to kill Duncan. I have no spur to prick the size of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other. How now? What news? So the intent is a horse, and Macbeth, ambition is a knight. Macbeth would be a sort of a centaur, and more or less one understands what he's saying here, but really only more or less, because is ambition a knight that vaults or a spur that pricks? And what is it that falls in the fourth line? According to some interpreters, it is the ambition knight that falls. According to other interpreters, it is the intent horse. And since both ambition and intent are so clumsy, why proceed at all? Truth is, we will never know why Macbeth wants to kill Duncan. And the fact that Lady Macbeth, I mean, in a sense, many soliloquies in Shakespeare are interrupted by the arrival of a character or something that happens. And I suspect that this is sort of theatrical genius of Shakespeare. He knows that he can't logically conclude the soliloquy, so he breaks it in half. We'll never know why Macbeth kills Duncan. This is Othello. He's walking into Desdemona's bedroom. He's about to kill her. It is the cause, my soul. Let me not name it to you, your chaste stars. It is the cause. Well, again, for some interpreters, the cause is Desdemona's supposed adultery. For others, it's the desire to avoid future betrayals or even to prevent the damnation of Desdemona's soul. They're not the same thing. And moreover, what seems to really torment Othello is not what Desdemona has done. It is the mere power of causality in human life. The cause. Causality is a force in tragedy, in a sense, especially in Othello, where Iago causes Othello to move almost like a puppet, whereas we never know what causes Iago to move. But, so these words evoke something profound about tragic form, but they do so in a very arcane, unfathomable way. It's often said that Verdi's Othello, the 19th century libretto, is more logical than Shakespeare's, and it's true, because Iago is given a great aria, Credo in un Dio crudel, I believe in a cruel God, which explains what Shakespeare did not explain. However, Shakespeare is Shakespeare precisely because he refused to explain certain things. So again, the question is why? Next step, and this is the last author I will briefly touch upon, it was taken by a playwright who, in my opinion, would have been the Shakespeare of the democratic age, but he died of typhus at 24. This is Büchner's Danton's Death, which is the one great tragedy about revolution. And it's a tragedy in which language acquires an astonishing power, even more than in Shakespeare. We will conclude simply and quickly, since everyone was created under the same conditions. No one may enjoy privileges, neither individuals nor larger classes. Each part of this proposition, in realizing itself, has killed its human beings. The 14th of July, the 10th of August, the 13th of May are its punctuation marks. Each part of this proposition has killed its human beings. Murder by words. Here it is. Jacobinism, wrote François Furet, the great historian of the French Revolution, radicalized the revolution by making it coincide with its discourse, and then brought to power the purest instance of such discourse. This is what we see. And you see here, Saint-Just still believes he is in control of his own language. But a later scene shows the other side of the coin. Danton, other great revolutionary figure, and his group have been jailed. They are led to the conciergerie, the prison, and there they're met and greeted by another prisoner. The galleries applaud and the Romans rub their hands, but they don't hear that each of these words is the death rattle of a victim. Try following your rhetoric to the point where it becomes flesh and blood. Look around you. All this you have spoken. Here is a visual translation of your words. These wretches, their hangmen, the guillotine, are your speeches come to life. All this you have spoken. Language, all powerful, but out of control, alienated. And this reaches its apex in two night scenes, one with Danton and one with Robespierre. Danton's death is a great tragedy about the revolution, but mind you, the conflict is not between the revolution and Ancien Regime. The conflict is within the revolution itself, between Danton and Robespierre. So they're both two night scenes. The first is Danton, who he cannot sleep. He's at the window. Macbeth shall sleep no more. September. Who cried this word? As I came to the window, something shrieked and cried in all the streets. September. September is the September of 1792, the massacres in the prisons of Paris. Danton was Minister of Justice. He did not instigate the massacre, but he let it happen. His wife wakes up, comes to the window. You're dreaming, Danton. He was just a child crying it in the night. You're trembling, Danton. What does that word want from me? Why does it stretch out its bloody hands towards me? Words kill, and so they have bloody hands. Robespierre, also also at night, also at the window. Why can't I get rid of this thought? With its bloody finger, blood in words, again, with its bloody fingers, it keeps pointing me towards the same spot. Robespierre's thoughts are not really his own thoughts anymore. I cannot tell which part of me is deceiving the other. He ends up repeating the words of perhaps the darkest tyrant in German 18th century tragedy, Philippe in Don Carlos, Ich bin allein, I am alone. We're all crazy, says Danton at a certain point, and there are several scenes of madness in the play, and there will be even more in Wojciech 2 years later. We're all puppets, Danton again. Puppets moved around by unknown forces. What appeared to be most manifest, this is Hannah Arendt writing on the French Revolution, what appeared most manifest was that none of the actors could control the course of events, that this course took a direction that had little, if anything, to do with their willful aims and purposes. The result was a feeling of awe and wonder at the power of history itself. Awe and wonder, this is almost an echo of Aristotle's pity and terror in the Poetics. If a historical event had the power to resurrect the kind of conflict of Antigone, well, the French Revolution must have been it. And Büchner, who co-authored subversive pamphlets, he lived with a ladder at a window for fear of being arrested. And with Wojciech, he wrote the first workers' tragedy. Büchner was the perfect playwright to write a modern Antigone. But in the most inspired moments of the play, his revolutionaries echo the great tragic tyrant, especially Shakespeare's, especially Macbeth. And they feel that what they've done is also a crime. I felt Republican virtue tremble in the depth of my heart, writes Robespierre, the real Robespierre, not in the play, to his brother when he witnesses the humiliation of Louis XVI. So Büchner, linguistic intensity, Shakespeare's before him, they express this disorientation, this literally lack of orientation of great historical ruptures. They heighten this sense of being lost. And they do so by turning it into an enigma. Antigone's clarity was a sign of mastery. She knew exactly what she wanted to do and knew exactly what the consequences would be, and she did it. She was fully aware of all that would happen. Shakespeare's and Büchner's metaphors have an incredible capacity to raise the temperature on stage and therefore to prompt their characters to action, but this action is a leap in the dark, is the opposite of mastery. Poetry, a lot of poetry here, but poetry blinds. So, unfathomable poetry or agonistic clarity? Which of these two our age needs most? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Moretti. I mean, you've given us so much food for thought, and I don't think I can even sum up the number of aspects that you've touched on. I mean, when you've talked about murder by words and some of the very important questions that you've posed, that why ancient Greece had the capacity which allowed enemies to speak, and that speaks for our own times in some senses, that why there is no possibility of speech in our current times. And of course, I mean, the questions that you raised about the clarity of tragic language and the opacity of tragic language and the enigma of tragic language itself, while touching about so many texts that we are familiar with, I'm sure, I mean, all of us will do have a lot of questions and will be thinking about it for a while. And I'm sure we will come back with our responses in some ways. But as I've been told that not only was our Zoom meeting full, but there were more than the number of people who could actually join here, which is 100, but more than 150 odd people on YouTube Live. And there are many, 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 many questions. So even though you've been generous and you've said that you will try to address as many as possible, but we don't really want to press you beyond your limits of generosity in some senses. So we will take a few questions which you can probably answer. And then when you get really tired, you can just tell us and we will put an end to that. And as I promised that we will certainly send all the questions and comments on email to you for you to have a look at how people responded, in what ways did they respond to the talk in some senses. So Professor Franco Moretti, we are so grateful to you for this absolutely brilliant talk and giving us so much to think about. And I won't really stand between you and the questions anymore. And I will now invite my dear friend Sakshi Dogra, who shall take up some of the questions and post to you, and then you can choose to answer. And it's your choice whether you want to answer individually or you want to take up a couple of questions together and then choose to answer. It's absolutely up to you, Professor Moretti. But thank you so much. We're really grateful.
Thank you once again, Professor Moretti, for taking the time out to speak to us today on this very important topic of tragedy and political conflict. It was an exceptional presentation, and like Professor Malhotra just shared, everyone who has joined is supremely eager to engage with you. So I'll just, if you'll allow, I'll just dive right into it. The first question we have is by Sango Bidani, who asks, how important a role does memory play in the inaction of tragedy, especially in plays like Hamlet, where he's inspired to take revenge for the death of his father by the words of the ghost?
So the question is about memory, correct?
Right.
Yeah, let me have another question. Maybe I can do two at a time. Yeah.
Sure. Abhishek Pandit asks, thanks for the eloquent presentation. It surely has made me rethink about the tragedies that we have been studying and teaching. However, I was wondering how inclusion of somebody like Ibsen would change your thesis on political and conflation of dialogic in the genre of tragedy.
Okay.
Shall I pose one more, or would you like to?
Yes, one more. Why not?
All right. Professor Isabel Karaman asks, thank you for a wonderful lecture. Do you have any thoughts on why we currently see an upsurge of rewritings of classical tragedy in novels, such as Camilla Shamsay's Home Fire? Why also this upsurge of tragedy from regions of the global south, especially South Africa?
Yeah. Okay. So let me begin with the last one. This is a enormously selective talk for the text that I proposed. When I begin, which I shall, at the end of this year, what I hope to be a study of tragedy that will last a few years, the most important challenge for me will be to try and understand tragic or quasi-tragic logic in cultures that are not European culture. This is a limit of my formation. I tried a few years ago in a course to teach a couple of African plays. I did my homework, I did what I could, but what the truth is, I understood that I was not that I knew too little about those traditions to fully understand them. I hope to do better in the book to come. This is a problem that we all have, and how much can a single individual do in trying to look at the entire panorama of world literature, and not only, you know, geographical, but also historical. And to me, it's always a little bit of a problem, and I always wish that our work proceeded in teams. This is just a personal answer to, you know, the fact that there are certain traditions that I do not know. The recent rewriting of tragedies, I suspect, I may be wrong, I suspect it has something to do, like all rewritings, with the fact that it has become harder to conceive of original tragic conflicts and tragic plots. And so you have these masterpieces from the past. You rewrite them in various ways. Some can be very intelligent, but that's not the point. It's as if modern times have been that modern tragedy after, in Europe, the fall of absolutist regimes has not been a very successful genre compared to lyric poetry, compared to novels, etc., etc. Of this, I'm still convinced. I mean, there is something that has happened in European literature. It may be different in Nigeria, in South Africa, seems to have lost the capacity to imagine a conflict to death. This would be my immediate response to the rewriting issue. But of course, right now I can't think of any rewrite on which I could nail the answer. The Ibsen question, so to speak, follows from what I just said. Ibsen is, to me, a fantastic playwright. He's the hero of the last chapter of my book on the bourgeois, and I think that he's the greatest tragic writer of what I would call the age of the novel. That is to say, an age in which the novel has become so powerful that people who want to write tragedies have to break the prison created by the new conventions of the novel. And in Ibsen, this is particularly clear because his characters, in order to unleash some kind of a conflict, have to break the linguistic medium which the novel has made ubiquitous, which is the medium of conversation. The novel has thrived on conversation, has turned conversation into a genuine art. Ibsen's plays begin in this novelistic atmosphere, this everyday language, and then a word is a little dissonant and a certain thing doesn't quite sound right, and then slowly conversation unravels and the moment of truth arrives. In this, you know, in this also Ibsen is very typical of modern times. His characters usually do not want at all to be involved in a tragedy. And they're forced into it in a way in which actors in previous tragedies were not. They seemed much more, the possibility of a conflict to death was a much more present one. In Ibsen, it's very remote, and it takes a lot for characters to become so. So, on the political significance of this, well, the to me most obvious answer is that Ibsen has made clear how difficult it is for modern tragedy, as opposed to Greek tragedy, but even Renaissance tragedy, to represent politics as such. Because Ibsen's tragedies are all family tragedies. So it's really, the war within the family, yes, but Eteocles and Polyneikes are parts of two armies, and they're in front of a city. The fate of a city depends on them. So it's a war within the family that is immediately linked to a higher political entity. Ibsen's families, the conflict that happens in them can have world historical tones. I think that at the end of Dollhouse, which is not a tragedy, no one dies in Dollhouse. Yes, a doctor dies, but because of illness, has nothing to do with tragic conflict. No one dies, and yet it's perhaps the most significant moment of conflict in Ibsen between a woman and a man. And Nora, the protagonist, she speaks, Nora is the modern Antigone. And this is not my idea. This has been said by a lot of people. It's true. There you really have the modern Antigone. It would be interesting to think why this modern Antigone manages to survive, luckily so. But the key thing is that between Nora and Helmer, there is a political conflict that takes place in a bourgeois drawing room. So it's political, but it is imprisoned within the walls of the private. So in that, Ibsen is really representative of the contradictions and the problems of modern tragedy. As for Hamlet, the role of memory in tragedy, the role of memory in tragedy is the genre where people never forget. So, in a sense, this creates another big, this is memorable. Now we think of Hamlet and Oedipus, but Hamlet has very little to do with Oedipus, really. I mean, despite what Freud wrote. Hamlet is instead extremely similar to the Oresteia cycle in Aeschylus. And the Oresteia were the memory of deeds that have been done generations before the play starts, not a few days, as in Hamlet, when the king has been killed, we assume a few days or a few weeks before the day. No, generations and generations before, and still they're present. And characters continue to act, continue to kill because of those acts that are still as if they had been committed yesterday. So the strength of memory in tragedy is really the sign of two things: of the strength of the absence of freedom, in a sense, that characters have, the force of necessity in human affairs, especially when human affairs are entwined with an idea of lineage, the family as a bloodline. Then, things become, memory becomes an enormous power. And the second thing is, okay, and when will this end? This is a question that is actually posed in these terms. When will this end in the Oresteia cycle? If A kills B and then C revenges B by killing A and then D revenges, when will it end? And Aeschylus had a stroke of genius in the third play of the cycle, with the verdict that turned the humanities, turned into a benign. But it's, a tragedy ends in a slaughter, like Hamlet, indeed, or else all other endings are kind of logically insufficient. We may be happy that people don't die, but that's another story. Aesthetically, and logically, they're insufficient. So memory is an enormous force, but it is so enormous that it creates both political and formal problems for tragedy. Next questions.
So I have a couple of questions which are a little repetitive, so I'm not going to go into them. There's a question by Razina who says, Sir, in a tragedy, if the real is ultimately the implied, would you call it the ultimate symbol of postmodernist exchange between ideologies? Shall I pose another question, Professor Moretti? There is a question by Albina Shakil who says, thank you for such a thought-provoking talk. In family conversations and life of my grandparents and parents, members would compete with each other over how tragic their lives were compared to others. In my generation, we compete with family and friends to show how happy we are. Though this is not a question directly about literary texts, do you think that there is an age or certain periods of tragedy, or is tragedy all pervasive?
Okay, no, certainly tragedy is an extremely discontinuous genre that has gone through long periods of disappearance, really. I mean, from 5th century Athens, in Europe at least, and then a brief period in Rome, but then it reappears quite late in once absolute states are being more or less constructed in Western Europe. So tragedy is not all pervasive. There are periods of much more so than the novel, so to speak, started without a theory, but then once it got going in the Middle Ages, it was a very regular experience. Tragedies is quite different. And as I said, I think that and again, this is not my own idea. A lot of people think that in the past 200 years, it has become quite difficult to write tragedies under advanced capitalism. Let's put it like this. This may suggest something also about the first question. Well, postmodernism doesn't really agree with the tragedy at all. Postmodernism, tragedy is a very logical form. You know, you all, I assume, study literature. Well, if you have to write or give a talk or give an exam about a novel, you will always find something to say. I mean, novels are just sprawling, and even a minor episode, you pull it out and it throws a new light on the plot, etc., etc. Tragedy is much more intolerant. You either sort of get to the center of tragedy, or you feel that you're just, as we say in Italy, you're just hitting water in the base, as if to say you're doing nothing. Postmodernism enjoys complex structures made of bricolage, where consistency and logical necessity are not important architectural principles. So I would keep, and indeed, postmodernism has laid claim to many forms, but hardly ever to tragic form. There have been essays on the postmodern sublime, and the sublime has something to do with tragedy. But again, and it's interesting because usually when critical discourse goes towards the sublime, it also goes towards tragedy, but in this case it hasn't. So that, I think, suggests a particular allergy between these two modes or styles, between this style and this form. Back to you.
Shraddha's made an interesting comment here. The point that you made about how difficult it gets to write tragedies in modern capitalism. Shraddha makes a comment saying that, perhaps that's why, we see so many writers writing dystopias instead. And increasingly one is, encountering this realization and manifestation of these utopias more often than not. There is also a question by Rahul Kumar who says that, could you please comment on the link between sacrificial rites and the birth of tragedy, a link that both Nietzsche and Freud assert?
First on the dystopia, you're absolutely right. I mean, the dystopia, in a sense, is the genre of a world where tragedy has become unimaginable, where everything has been, where tragedy, where a conflict with a chance to different outcomes has become unimaginable. A dystopia will still crush human beings, but in Antigone, you have the sense of two powers that oppose each other, and you don't have the feeling that there is only one way in which things can go. In fact, especially in Greek tragedy, especially because of the structure of the dialogue, you often have this feeling that they could go in many different directions. Dystopias are much more leaden and consistent in this respect. Oh my God, the other question was, sacrificial. The sacrificial. This of course is part of the theory of tragedy in Nietzsche and then later in Girard. I'm not convinced by this theory, I have to say. I'm not convinced because it seems to me to miss what to me is the most important aspect, that is to say, conflict. Once you have a sacrifice, you basically have a community that agrees on a certain solution, and then a poor individual who is the victim of this state of affairs, often innocent. But the point of tragic form seems to me to be different. And even though, of course, people die, and in some cases, one has the feeling that it is truly a sacrifice that is being enacted. Say, Ophelia in Hamlet. Ophelia is not killed by anyone, right? She either kills herself or drowns in her madness. But in a sense, you feel that she has been sacrificed to the strife within the court. She's one of those neutral human beings who didn't want to choose between her beloved and her father, and therefore is killed by this state of affair. But, well, beautiful and sad and important as Ophelia's death is, the real force in Hamlet and in so many other plays is really the struggle between antagonists rather than the destiny of the sacrificial being.
Shall I band two more questions together? And all right. Abhishek Pundir again asks, I strongly feel even the characters in groups that intend to remain neutral suffer in the course of a tragedy. And this suffering of the neutrals could be an underside of the greater tragedy that unfolds for tragic heroes. Can we also bring it to center to map the political conflict? And would that also principally redefine tragedy? Sango Bidani asks, if I understood correctly, you mentioned that in novels, repetition is less frequent. You mentioned that repetition is less frequent in novels than in tragedies. However, how would you look at a novel such as Marquez's Chronicles of a Death Foretold, where the death of Santiago Nassar is mentioned as a memory throughout the novel before the definitive action is only shown in the final chapter of the novel.
No, okay. Very, very reasonable objection. What I meant was not that there cannot be novels in which repetition plays a role. Picaresque novels, for instance, characters re-encounter people they had met earlier. This happens. The time constraints, I probably used slightly ambiguous words. What I wanted to say was this, that in tragedy, important acts tend to be repeated because this is the surest way to make them appear as decisions and not as accidents. So in this sense, repetition has a structural role in tragedy that it does not have in novels. Novels actually use accidents, coincidences very happily. Tragedy has a different kind of world that it tries to represent. And through repetitions, it manages to construct this world in which human beings are profoundly responsible for their choices. Responsible doesn't mean that they make these choices rationally, fully, no, but they are their choices. Macbeth also, he kills once. Then, well, I have to kill again, and he does it again. And then he has to do it again, and he does it again. So again, there, Macbeth acts in a sort of fog, as I tried to say. It's not clear why he's doing what he's doing, and often, it has some great poetry in which it's never entirely clear what has happened, but that he is responsible for what has happened. This is clear, and this is achieved via repetition. Novels are less exacting from this point of view, and so repetition plays a less structural role or a different role. And the previous question, Sakshi, was?
In fact, if I could just pose one more question.
Okay.
By Michael Carlo Villas, and he asks, is tragedy possible in very religious cultures who cannot afford to oppose these higher powers? I'm asking this because I have not encountered an Asian tragedy, even if our lives in the former colonies of Europe are mostly tragic. The second question, of course, was the question concerning those who are neutral and who suffer in the course of the.
That's right. So yes, tragedy is definitely possible in religious cultures. In Greek tragedies, gods and goddesses appear all the time. That was their religion, and definitely Racine was a very Christian playwright. Lope de Vega and Calderon were very Christian writers. One of them was a priest, even. Shakespeare's world is a little more complicated, but that certainly was a Christian culture as well. I do not know about the Asian situation. That, again, is a limit of my knowledge, or perhaps an instance of my ignorance. So, but in general, there is no question that tragedy, in fact, is perhaps especially possible in religious cultures. Maybe one of the reasons for its difficulty, and I'm speaking of modern Europe now, the last 200 years, is a certain secularization of life. It's not, I don't think it's the main reason, but I think it could be one of the reasons. As for the neutral characters, yes, that is a very good question. And, maybe one could try a bold critical experiment with tragedy, which is the opposite of what I've tried today. Today, I've decided to focus on conflict and therefore on the main characters who are usually the bearers of conflict. But what if one were to look at the Ophelias of the play rather than the Hamlets and the Kings? Would this be a completely different scene? And would the political meaning be different? This, I think, it's not something that I have done. I don't know. I mean, so much has been written on tragedy. Maybe someone has already done this, and it would be very interesting for me to read it. Certainly, I want to think about it because it, it changes the elements of the problem. It just changes the equation, so to speak, and it is truly a truly fascinating idea. This of focusing on the characters in the middle rather than the characters at the extremes. So I would just keep thinking about that.
Thank you for this fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
Professor Moretti, no, thank you so much for your generosity.
Oh, thank you.
And now if I could, call upon Professor Malhotra to perhaps say a few words.
Professor Moretti, I think we have no words really, and the excitement around your talk and the number of questions. And like I said, that we still haven't even gone to the questions on the YouTube feed, but that's the limitation of the time that we have. We can't possibly pose all the questions to you. And there are lots of people who've been messaging and saying that can we ask questions outside the talk about all the other works that he's written. So I said that will require another lifetime. So I don't think we can really be that unfair to Professor Moretti, and you've been so generous with your scholarship, with your work, with sharing your work and indulging us and being with us, and of course, being so generous with your time as well. So we can't really thank you enough, Professor Moretti. I mean, it's been such an honor and privilege for us to host you, but there's a formal vote of thanks also, which should be part of all the rituals of a talk. And so for that, I'm going to ask my friend to do that job. But honestly, I mean, I speak on behalf of everybody, I'm sure that we're really, really delighted. And there's so much of food for thoughts that your talk has given to us. I mean, all of us who are engaged in these questions will need to rethink many of the things that we've been thinking with in some ways. And we will have to think through what you've said and think about our own times and, of course, what we teach. And we can't really thank you enough, Professor Moretti. You've been so kind, and it's really been such an honor to have you here.
Well, as you can see, I enjoy myself enormously. Was very happy.
I believe Professor Malhotra has already been able to carry a lot of our grateful emotions for this, but as the event demands, good evening, everyone. It has been quite an event, really. On behalf of the Department of English and the organizing team, I would like to thank everyone who made this event successful. First and foremost, a huge thank you to our speaker, Professor Moretti, who has been so kind to us by giving us so much to think about. We will no doubt be talking about today's discussion for quite some time into the future. Thank you for lending us so much of your time and for sharing your work with us. Thank you so much. As always, thank you to our HOD, Professor Sunil Malhotra, who's the leading force behind this lecture series and today's talk. I'm sure this is going to be just one of the many more such interesting events to come, and I look forward to what's going to come in the future. And thank you, of course, to Shraddha and Sakshi and everybody on the organizing team who are responsible for running our event so smoothly. And thank you so much to our audience, everyone who tuned in today from all sorts of time zones and places. Thank you so much, friends, and we hope to see you all again very soon. For the questions that we haven't been able to pose in today's talk, please be sure that we will be sending them over to Professor Moretti, and they will reach Professor very soon, and hopefully you'll see them upcoming in the future as Professor Moretti has promised us. So please stay safe and be well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Bye.
Professor
Thank
Moretti.
you so much, Professor Moretti. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Goodbye. Goodbye, my dears.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.